How do people survive winter temperatures that drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius without a single radiator, without underfloor heating, without any of the systems we consider absolutely essential for staying alive in the cold? That question stopped me completely the first time I thought about it seriously. The answer comes from the Mongolian steppe, and it involves a structure that has been outsmarting brutal winters for over 1,000 years. Let me walk you through exactly how it works. When most people imagine a traditional dwelling, they picture corners, four walls, right angles, spaces where cold air can pool and settle. The Mongolian ger, called a gers in the Mongolian language, takes a completely different approach, and the shape itself is doing serious work before you even light a fire. The round structure of a gers is not a stylistic choice or an aesthetic preference. It is an engineering decision that emerged from centuries of living in one of the most extreme climates on the planet. Here is what the circular shape actually does. When the fierce steppe winds hit a round wall, they have nowhere to grab. The surface curves away from the wind rather than catching it head on. A square building gives wind a flat face to slam against, creating pressure points, cold spots, and structural stress. A round building simply deflects. The air moves around the walls and continues on its way, and the structure loses far less heat through wind chill penetration as a result. Inside, the circular layout means warm air circulates evenly around the entire living space. There are no corners where cold air collects and sits. In a rectangular room, you will often feel noticeable temperature differences between the center and the edges, particularly in corners. A gers eliminates that problem by eliminating corners entirely. The warmth produced at the center has a clear, unobstructed path to every part of the interior. The low, slightly domed roof also plays a role that is easy to overlook. In a tall building, heated air rises and collects near the ceiling, far above where people are actually living and breathing. A gers keeps the roof close to the occupants, which means the warmth stays in the inhabited zone rather than drifting up and away. Every aspect of the shape is working together, and that is before we even talk about what sits in the center of the room. The real secret to why this structure stays warm has everything to do with what happens at the heart of the gers. In Mongolian, the stove at the center of the gers is called a zuk, and its placement is not random. Every single gers has one, and it sits directly in the geometric center of the circular floor plan. This positioning is the difference between a heating system that works and one that leaves cold patches throughout the living space. When heat originates from the center of a circle, it radiates outward in every direction simultaneously, which means no wall, no sleeping area, no corner of the room is significantly farther from the heat source than any other. Compare that to a fireplace built into one wall of a rectangular room. The area directly in front of it gets scorching. The far corners stay cold. You end up with dramatic temperature gradients and the constant sensation that you are either too hot or not warm enough, depending on where you are standing. The zuk eliminates that problem through geometry. The chimney pipe that extends from the zuk runs straight upward through the roof opening, which the Mongolians call the tuuno. This vertical path gives smoke an efficient exit while keeping the heat inside the structure. The design minimizes the distance. Smoke travels through the interior before escaping, which reduces both smoke accumulation and the amount of heat that escapes with it. The pipe itself also radiates heat outward as it runs through the gers, adding to the overall warmth of the space. What burns inside the zuk is its own fascinating story, and we will get to that shortly. But first, it is worth understanding what surrounds those walls, because the insulation system in a gers is quietly one of the most effective natural solutions to cold weather that human beings have ever developed. The walls of a gers are made from a wooden lattice framework called a khana, and draped over that framework are multiple layers of felt called sgi in Mongolian. This felt is not the thin craft material you might be imagining. Traditional Mongolian sgi is dense, heavy, and made entirely from sheep's wool, compressed together through a labor-intensive process that produces sheets of material with remarkable insulating properties. The reason wool works so well, as insulation comes down to the microscopic structure of wool fibers themselves. Each fiber has a natural crimp to it, and when wool is compressed into felt, those crimped fibers create millions of tiny pockets of trapped air throughout the material. Air is one of the most effective insulators that exists, and the more air you can trap in a given space, the slower heat moves through it. Your body heat stays inside. The external cold stays outside. Wool does this naturally without any manufacturing process, without any synthetic components, through pure fiber structure. Multiple layers of SGI are applied to the walls of a gear, and during the harshest months of winter, Mongolian families will often add additional layers on top of the standard covering. The amount of felt applied to a gear can essentially be tuned to the severity of the conditions outside. More felt means more trapped air pockets. Means slower heat loss, means a warmer interior with less fuel consumption. It is a remarkably scalable system. The same material is also used for rugs and floor coverings inside the gear. You are not just insulating the walls, you are surrounding yourself with wool on multiple surfaces simultaneously, creating a whole environment insulation effect. And the way the roof opening manages the relationship between ventilation and heat retention might surprise you more than anything so far. The tonneau, the circular opening at the crown of the gear, looks at first glance like a vulnerability. A hole in the roof during a Mongolian winter seems counterintuitive, like designing a boat with a drain. But the tonneau is one of the most cleverly engineered elements of the entire structure, and it is doing two essential jobs at the same time. The first job is ventilation. The zook at the center of the gear produces smoke, and that smoke needs to exit. The tonneau sits directly above the stove, aligned perfectly so that the chimney pipe from the zook passes straight through it. The geometry of this arrangement creates a natural draft that pulls combustion gases upward and out of the living space. Without adequate ventilation, a sealed structure with an active stove would quickly become dangerous. The tonneau solves this problem without any mechanical assistance. The second job is light. During daylight hours, the tonneau functions as a skylight, allowing natural light to enter the interior from directly above. In a structure without windows of significant size, this overhead opening provides meaningful illumination and also serves a practical timekeeping function. Mongolian herders have historically used the angle and movement of sunlight through the tonneau to gauge the time of day. During extreme cold, a flap called an urk can be partially or fully drawn over the tonneau opening. When the flap is closed, heat retention improves dramatically. The balance between closing the urk for warmth and keeping it open enough for the stove to function safely requires attention and experience, and managing that balance is a daily skill for families living in gers. Below the opening, the floor itself is doing something that most people would never think to look at when studying how a gear stays warm. Ground cold is a serious and often underestimated factor in any unheated or minimally heated structure. The earth, particularly frozen earth, acts as a constant heat sink, drawing warmth away from anything in contact with it. A gear sitting directly on bare ground would lose a significant portion of its internally generated heat directly downward, no matter how well insulated the walls and roof might be. Mongolian gear design addresses this through portable floor systems. Many gears are set up over wooden floor panels that create a physical barrier between the interior space and the frozen ground below. Wood is a poor conductor of heat, which means it resists the transfer of warmth from the interior down into the earth. Even a thin wooden platform creates a meaningful improvement in floor temperature compared to bare ground. On top of these platforms, and sometimes without platforms where they are unavailable, families layer thick rugs, wool carpets, and animal skins. In Mongolian, these floor coverings collectively help create what amounts to a multi-layer floor insulation system. The combination of wood and wool can keep the interior floor temperature noticeably higher than it would be without any insulation, reducing both the amount of fuel needed to maintain comfort and the overall heat loss from the gear. The portability of these floor systems matters enormously. Mongolian herding families are semi-nomadic, moving their gears seasonally to follow pasture for their animals. Every component of the gear, including the floor panels, must be packed, transported on animal back or cart, and reassembled at the new location. The floor solution balances effectiveness with the practical reality of a life spent moving across the steppe. What those families put into the stove to generate the heat that these systems then retain is itself a story worth understanding. In an environment where trees are scarce and firewood is not consistently available, Finding a fuel source that burns reliably and for extended periods is a survival requirement, not a preference. Traditional Mongolian stove fuel solved this problem through one of the most practical and effective solutions available on the open steppe. Dried animal dung, called argal in Mongolian, has been the primary fuel for zook stoves for centuries. Argal comes primarily from sheep, goats, and cattle, all of which are central to the Mongolian herding economy. The dung is collected, dried in the open air, and stored for use as fuel. When dry, it burns slowly and steadily in a way that makes it ideal for maintaining a consistent temperature over long periods. Unlike wood, which can burn hot and fast and require frequent reloading, dried argal produces a more even, sustained heat output that suits the demands of keeping a gear warm through a long winter night. The slow-burning quality of argal means families are not waking up repeatedly to reload the stove. A well-built fire of dried argal in a zook can maintain usable warmth for hours with minimal attention. In regions where nothing grows taller than the grass under your feet, this is an extraordinarily important practical advantage. Modern Mongolia has seen a shift in fuel use, particularly in urban areas and in the large semi-urban gear districts surrounding the capital city of Ulaanbaatar. Coal has become widely used as an alternative to argal, particularly in contexts where access to grazing land and livestock is more limited. Coal burns longer and hotter than argal and is available commercially, but it also produces more particulate pollution, which has become a significant environmental and public health challenge in cities where thousands of gear stoves burn coal simultaneously during winter months. The traditional argal system, by contrast, is deeply integrated with the herding lifestyle in a way that makes the fuel supply essentially self-renewing as long as the animals are healthy. What happens after the fire does its work and night falls on the steppe is itself a carefully designed system. The human body generates a significant amount of heat continuously, and Mongolian gear sleeping arrangements are specifically designed to capture and retain that biological warmth, rather than letting it dissipate into the surrounding space. Beds inside a gear are positioned along the interior walls, following the circular perimeter of the structure. This placement keeps the central floor area open and accessible, while also positioning sleepers in the zone where retained heat from the insulated walls is most concentrated. Bedding in a traditional gear is layered heavily. Thick blankets made from wool, coverings made from animal furs, and multiple layers of textile work, together to trap the body heat of the sleeper within the sleeping space. The principle is identical to the one used in modern sleeping bags rated for extreme cold. Create a small, enclosed airspace around the body, and let body heat warm that space rather than trying to heat the entire room to a high enough temperature to compensate for uninsulated sleeping conditions. During the most extreme months of winter, when overnight temperatures on the steppe or in the Gobi Desert can drop to depths that are genuinely dangerous, families sleep in close proximity to one another. Multiple bodies in a shared sleeping space multiply the biological heat input and reduce the surface area through which each individual loses warmth to the surrounding air. This is not simply cultural preference, it is practical thermodynamics applied to daily survival. The stove may be kept burning through the night at a lower intensity or allowed to bank down and be revived in the morning. The combination of insulated walls, layered bedding, and shared body heat allows a family to maintain survivable and even relatively comfortable sleeping temperatures, without running the zook at full capacity all night. Even the door of the gear has been positioned with thermal logic in mind. The Mongolian steppe is not simply cold in winter, it is windy, and the winds that sweep across that landscape come predominantly from the north, carrying Arctic air southward across the open grasslands with very little to slow them down. The traditional Mongolian gear addresses this fact directly through the standard placement of its door, called the kaalga. Gear doors almost universally face south. This is a practice so consistent and so widely observed across Mongolian culture that it has become a standard element of gear construction and placement. The reason is straightforward. A south-facing door is pointing directly away from the predominant direction of the dangerous, cold, northerly winds. When wind comes from the north and the door is on the south side, the entire body of the gear stands between the wind and the entrance. The structure itself becomes a windbreak for its own doorway. This means that every time the door is opened, the cold air that enters comes from the relatively sheltered south-facing side rather than from the wind-driven north. The momentary temperature drop from opening the door to enter or exit is significantly reduced compared to what would happen with a north-facing entrance. Over the course of a winter day with multiple comings and goings, this adds up to a meaningful reduction in heat loss through the doorway. The kyalga itself is typically heavy and well-fitted, often covered with felt on its interior face as an additional insulating layer. The felt covering on the door continues the same principle used on the walls, reducing the rate at which cold penetrates through the entrance point. But what residents wear while moving through that door and inside the gear functions as its own layer of protection that works alongside all these structural solutions. The traditional Mongolian garment known as the deel is a long, wraparound robe that has been worn across Mongolia and Central Asia for centuries. It crosses over the body and fastens at the side, creating a sealed, enclosed space of still air around the torso, which is where the body generates and loses the most heat. The design creates the same effect as a sleeping bag for the moving body, trapping warmth close to the skin, regardless of what the surrounding air temperature might be. Traditional deels are constructed from wool, cotton, or silk, depending on the season and the region, and they are typically lined with additional material for warmth during winter. The warmest winter deels are lined with fur or sheepskin, creating a garment that functions as a portable, wearable insulation layer of remarkable effectiveness. A person wearing a heavy winter deel is, in thermal terms, walking around inside a layer of insulation, essentially equivalent to a portion of the gear wall. The significance of this for home heating is direct and practical. When residents wear deels indoors, they do not need to maintain the interior temperature as high as they would if they were sitting in light clothing. The clothing extends the effective range of the stove by adding personal insulation on top of the structural insulation of the gear itself. The stove can burn at a lower rate, consuming less argol or coal, while the occupants remain comfortable because the deel is bridging the gap between ambient temperature and body warmth. This principle of layering applies to every element of the gear heating system. Each layer, whether structural felt, interior carpeting, bedding, or clothing, adds to the cumulative effect. And the final element of that system is perhaps the simplest of all, yet it ties everything together in a way that makes the entire approach work even in the most extreme conditions. A gear is intentionally small. The diameter of a standard gear typically falls between 5 and 8 meters, giving an interior floor area that might feel modest by contemporary urban housing standards. But that compact scale is not a limitation. It is a deliberate feature of the design, and it is one of the reasons the entire system functions as effectively as it does. Heating a large space requires either a large heat source or an extremely well-insulated enclosure, or both. A small space requires far less energy to bring to a comfortable temperature and far less energy to maintain at that temperature once reached. The single zook at the center of a standard gear can heat the entire interior without any secondary heat source, precisely because the volume of air that needs to be warmed is modest, and the insulating envelope surrounding it is highly effective. In the context of the Gobi Desert winters and the open steppe where temperatures regularly plunge to levels that challenge even modern cold weather equipment, this efficiency is not merely convenient, it is the difference between surviving the night and not. Every design choice in the gear converges on this point. Minimize the volume to be heated, maximize the insulation surrounding that volume, place the heat source at the optimal central position, and let the occupants themselves contribute through their clothing and their closeness to one another. What the Mongolian gear represents is not a primitive response to cold weather. It is a sophisticated, multi-layered thermal management system developed and refined over generations of living in conditions that demanded real solutions. From the circular shape that deflects wind and distributes heat, to the SGEI felt walls that trap air and slow heat loss, to the south-facing kyalga that reduces wind-driven cold entry, to the deel that extends each person's personal thermal envelope, every element has a purpose, and every element works with every other element. The result is a structure that can keep a family warm through a -40°C night, using nothing more than dried animal dung, sheep wool, and a carefully designed wooden frame. that is not just impressive. It is a reminder that some of the most effective engineering ever done was carried out not in laboratories or universities, but on a freezing steppe by people whose lives depended on getting it right. If you think that is impressive, wait until you see how Mongolian nomads survive -40-degree winters inside a felt tent.